You're listening to Coffee and Culture. We're on Talk 1260 and 103.7 KTRC here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, streaming at santafe.com. We're on the air just after 2 p.m. on Saturdays and Sundays, and I am your host every other week. My name is Matthew Chase Daniel, and today I'm talking by Zoom with Melanie Kirby. I happen to be out of town in Los Angeles for a little bit. So we're doing this by Zoom, and I haven't met Melanie before, but I have heard about her. My wife, Julie, was involved with a project called Poetry Pollinators, which were making sort of native bee nesting houses along the Santa Fe River with panels with local poets' poetry there. And so she learned about Melanie's work and is a big enthusiast of that. And so sort of an introduction through that. And Melanie Kirby, you're from Tortugas, Pueblo, down near Las Cruces, I understand. Is that correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I was born and raised in the Las Cruces area, and my family, yes, has been members of Tortugas Pueblo forever.
Forever, forever and ever. Yeah. My wife grew up down there, was born there, and in Las Cruces, not at Tortugas. But I spent a lot of time down there. So I have a affection for that part of the state, which often people in Santa Fe don't know anything about. So glad to,
It's true. Yeah, a lot of people haven't even heard of Tortugas Pueblo, but we
yeah.
are cousins to Isleta and Taos Pueblos, and we're Tiwa ancestry. And I myself actually also have a few dashes of this and that. I have Mescalero Apache as well, and some Spanish. I actually just did a genealogy test, and I thought, oh, I'd probably see, 5 to 6. I actually had 22 indigenous ethnic groups
All
in my
right.
genealogy. So there's a lot I still need to learn about my ancestry, but
That's
definitely
amazing.
rooted here in New Mexico. So
Yeah. Yeah. Um, And so, Melanie, you do a lot of work around bees. That's your sort of focus. And I was reading some of your work, and it was saying that you were sort of introduced to beekeeping when you were in the Peace Corps in South America, maybe in Paraguay. Is that right?
that is right. That was actually 30 years ago. This September will be my 30-year anniversary. So I am forever grateful that the bees found me in the jungles of South America. Um, and they've just been the most awesome teachers. And, I always tell people nothing like a bug to put you in your place every time you think you figured it out. There's always so much more to learn. But yeah, they've really connected me to, the larger implications of not only agroecology, but stewardship and conservation, and education. But really, they go beyond borders, and they really do connect us to each other and to our planet. So
Yeah.
it's been very
And
thrilling.
was the beekeeping in the communities you were in Paraguay, it was done for honey production mostly, or was there an awareness of the agricultural or the pollinator aspect of it for the greater community, or was it more trying to get honey and not
It
thinking about the rest?
it
How was
was
that?
actually pretty multifaceted. Where I was located was in the what they call the Cerros of Ubaturusu, which means wind from the hills in Guarani. So I worked with Guarani um, farmers, and there had been a lot of deforestation
Hmm.
for sugarcane.
Hmm.
And so there had been a couple projects before mine with other volunteers really promoting agroforestry, and so creating food forests. And a lot
Taking
of
back some of where the sugar cane had been grown, or
yes, yes, and also diversifying what spaces were left
mhm.
um, into, sort of multi-use um, applications. So that included, whether it was citrus groves or bananas, but then also having bees and also growing gardens and having livestock. So a lot of permaculture rooted methodologies were implemented, and we definitely tried to make it what we call appropriate technology, right? So working within the means and the accessibility of the locals. And so for a lot of them, actually, they liked honey as a sweetener, but since they had so much sugar cane, it wasn't that they were desperate for sweet, but it was more so regarded as a medicine. So a
Interesting.
lot of them used it actually, yeah, topically for different wounds, but then also for making you know, cough syrups. The wax they could make into salves. They used a lot of the wax also for different, whether it was for polishing or lacquering, even sewing, to help coat needles and threads. So there was a lot of different uses for it. And interesting, I also got to work with the youth a lot with the stingless bees, the melipona, and the youth were really good at finding those because they're smaller colonies, and that honey was considered really, really medicinal and could get almost 4 times the price of
Tell me, I don't know what those are. Stingless bees, melipona.
stingless bees. They're mostly in the tropics, although there have been some found in California actually that were imported in for some research. And I think I read an
Escaped.
article that, yeah, that they were brought in about 60 years ago, and then they just found some remaining colonies actually in the Palo Alto area. Um, but not all of them produce, a lot of honey, and they build their hives actually more in stacked combs, kind of like pancakes, versus
Hmm.
hanging combs. They also don't have a single queen. They usually have multiple princesses.
And
And
are they indigenous to South America, or are they from Europe, or what's their
no, that
story?
they're endemic to there, but they also exist like in some Asian countries and tropical countries. They're tropical species, at least the ones that I got to work with. There's a number of different kinds. But yeah, instead of having stingers, they nibble instead.
Hmm.
So they still do defend their nests, but they don't have
It's not quite the
venom-filled
same.
stingers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those bee stings can be intense.
Yeah, they can.
Have
Those can
you,
also be considered medicine too,
right,
though.
I know people, right, who have bee sting therapy.
Hmm.
Um, I've never done that.
In Santa Fe, we had for a while the Hoshindo Institute by Boyce Sterling Jones, and I believe um, one of her original students is Joyce Roeder, who lives in Madrid, and she, I believe, still practices. And a number of students came out of the institute, and that's actually was focused on a Japanese form of what you call apipuncture, right? So using micro taps with bee stings for treating a variety of ailments, and a lot of people have found relief, whether it was from Lyme disease or lupus or other Parkinson's, nervous conditions. I mean, there's a whole field of science and practice to it. I think here in the States, we're a little bit uh, slower to know about it and become familiar with it, but across the world, cultures around the world have really connected with bees on numerous levels. We tend to just think it's honey, but that's just the start of it.
Right. Yeah. No, it's interesting when you're talking about the guarani using the wax and medicinally and as a salve for wounds. And um, in our Western post in mega industrial culture where you can get a salve, at any corner pharmacy for anything, we don't think of the fact that like honey is a great antimicrobial, which is somewhat always been, I've heard of that, and it's always been counterintuitive to me because you think sugar makes things, ferment and fester, but honey's different that way. And it's full, like making mead, fermented honey, just regular honey doesn't need to be refrigerated, it doesn't ferment. But if you thin it out with water, it becomes
Mhm.
fermentable because it's dilute that way.
Right. Well, and yeast can handle it, but I think when you have pure honey, and especially pure raw honey, the sugar concentration is so high that bacteria can't survive in it,
Right.
actually. So, I mean, water is life even for bacteria, right? Like
Right.
they need some water. And with honey, the water content is so low that that yeah, it really minimizes that. But that really depends on where people live, especially for us here in the high desert. Um, uh, you know, we have minimal water, and so plants are extremely smart, right? They're not going to be pumping out all of their water, through their nectar during high noon when it's the hottest part of the day. So, we also have the cool nights, which is really fantastic because then the plants will actually pull up the sugars because it prevents them from freezing. And so
Oh,
then once
interesting.
they do offer nectar, it's very sweet. And so our honeys here really do have more of a natural sucrose content than say like if we were in the bayou or something like that
Oh,
where it's really
interesting.
humid.
Wow.
Hmm.
Wow. We got to go
Honeys
to a
from wetter
break.
places can ferment. Oh, sure.
Yeah. We got to go to a break. We'll be right back. My name's Matthew Chase Daniel. I'm talking with Melanie Kirby about bees and bee-related things. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. My name's Matthew Chase Daniel, talking with Melanie Kirby. We're on the air on 1260 AM and 1037 FM. That's KTRC, streaming online at santafe.com. Also, podcasts of this and other shows that I've done, you can find wherever on my website at chasedaniel.com or on Spotify and Amazon and those kind of things at Coffee and Culture with Matthew Chase Daniel. So, Melanie, I was looking through your stuff and I made a little list of places that you've like traveled a whole lot outside of New Mexico. So, what from southern New Mexico and to Paraguay and Hawaii and Michigan and Jamaica. And I don't know if you've lived in all those places or just spent a little time, but it's sort of fascinating. Look, it must be fascinating. It's interesting to me. I'd be interested to hear how different, and we were touching on this about the sucrose content in a humid environment compared to a dry environment, the relationship to bees and to pollinators in different climates and different cultures to some degree that you have learned about.
Oh yeah, like I mentioned, they've been the greatest teachers and they really have taken me around the world. I would have never have dreamed of all of these places. So I've really am forever grateful that I've had the opportunities that I've had and been able to build a thriving network of other sort of bee geeks and plant enthusiasts. But that's one of the things that I love about traveling. I guess I could describe myself a little bit as a closet foodie. I mean, first of all, who doesn't love to eat? Like I love to eat. And so, being able to go to different places and try their foods, I feel like it's almost a natural extension of like, okay, this is a taste of their landscape, right? This is their terroir, right?
Mm,
That we get to tap into. And the same can be said for honey, right? So honey, the nectars and the pollens are coming from whatever's growing on that landscape. That's what the bees are collecting. And so, for us here in New Mexico, I mean, you can turn a corner or drive a few miles, and even the honeys will be different from each other depending on what's blooming and when it's harvested. And then the same can be said for when you go to these other places. If it's a tropical climate, it'll be very different than if it's, say, a much colder climate or a temperate climate. So you get a real taste of the landscape by tasting the honeys, almost like wine tasting, right? Like
yeah,
the
there's
grapes
that
you taste the
guy
wine.
who sells honey on the side of Old Las Vegas Highway in Santa Fe.
Hmm.
And I've stopped there in the past, and there's like orange blossom honey and mesquite honey and all these different honeys from different plants. And so are those when so bees are like transported to different
Hmm.
agricultural areas, the same bees, right? And they'll be go up during the almond season in California to pollinate the almond trees, and then they'll go to the orange groves to and move the hives moved around on trucks and things like that. And is that how those different honeys are produced? Like how you get orange honey, it's because you have your hives all in the orange grove for a while?
Yeah, I mean, there are some producers who are what we call migratory, and
Hmm.
they basically follow different nectar flows, or what we also describe as pollination events, right? So there's a big demand for pollination. And in some places, there's not enough pollinators available to fit that demand. Part of that is a result of monocrop agriculture, which has its, I want to say, issues, right? And
For
so
sure.
on the one hand, you can really kind of saturate an area with one particular kind of bloom, and then you get that predominant nectar and that flavor. So you get like a single, what we call a monofloral honey. That's, orange blossom or clover. And then in other places where there's a variety of blooms, you'll get more multifloral sort of bouquets of honey. And that tends to be what we get here in New Mexico because, as we know, we're limited water, and so we all congregate around the same watering holes.
Right.
And plants are very, very smart beings, and they'll once we get water, they all kind of bloom at once. So, I mean, I really feel like our New Mexico honeys are very exquisite because they're multifloral. They just have these amazing bouquets and aromas and flavors that explode in your mouth because it's just so many different things at once. I mean, and what we notice them visiting on is probably just a fraction of what they're really visiting.
Right.
There's little tiny plants, there's also tree blooms, there's ornamentals, there's, folks with gardens, but also a lot of wildflowers. And so it can really, be very diverse. But yeah, so those folks who do migrate, usually they have a sort of route that they're following. Um, and I'm interested in this topic even more so now because as we see shifting climate, we're going to see a lot of migratory situations come to light. I think, I mean, animals of all different, backgrounds have been migratory, following their own forage and food needs and shelter needs, right?
Hmm.
But the same can be said for insects, and the same can be said for humans as well. So
Right.
it's a pretty natural process, but I think in terms of sort of the maximization of it and the demands that have been put on um, honeybees in particular is nothing that I think anybody really anticipated. Honeybees are not necessarily considered endemic to this continent, though there is fossil evidence that they have an ancestor honeybee here called Apis nearctica. So
Hmm.
similar to horses, they were here, and then something happened, probably an ice age event, and then they were reintroduced. Um, but it's not their fault that they've become the exploited poster children of
Right.
pollinators.
Are
I
there
kind of
other
describe them as a
pollinate
gateway.
are they exploited because they're the most efficient pollinator or the only pollinator of like citrus or almonds or these big
No,
monoculture crops or
no, I think they've become, you know, sort of the go-to pollinator because there's been more ability to manage them.
Mhm.
They live in cavities, and so as humankind figured out how to, fabricate abodes and then move these abodes, then it became easier to manage them, um, like livestock, right? Whereas a lot of the other solitary bee species, their numbers are much smaller. They're
Mhm.
either in the ground or they're in hollow reeds, or they're carpenter bees are drilling into wood, and so that becomes a little bit harder to move around.
Right.
But they're not necessarily the most efficient at everything. They are considered generalists, meaning they eat a lot of different things. So I think
I
that's
see.
another reason
Right.
why they've also, become sort of the commonplace bee. But
Right. And
you know,
here's is another, so you're saying that when you have these big monocultures, there's not enough bees living there naturally sometimes, which is why they import colonies. Is that because, say, almonds maybe all bloom within a certain time of the year, and so they need a lot of pollinators for that month, or maybe.
yeah, you
And
hit the nail
then
on the
for the
head.
other
Yeah,
11 months, it's not blooming, and so the bees have nothing to eat because nothing else is growing
exactly.
because it's all been turned into almond groves.
Right.
And
It becomes a food desert, actually.
right,
So there are some efforts to get more hedgerows in and some diversified plantings, cover crops. Not only for, hives that are there, especially if there are what we call stationary beekeepers, right? So ones that don't move their hives, they definitely are trying to make sure that their bees have access to forage over the whole growing season, right? So that they
Right.
have enough to put away the reserves they need. But also there's a lot of other bee species and pollinator species that also need food. And a lot of them, especially the smaller they are, the distance that they travel is much smaller. So they're
Mm.
not going to fly miles and miles to find food, but maybe actually just, a few like yards, right? And
Right.
so they need to have that in their vicinity. But unfortunately, a monocrop agriculture, I think, just the industrialization of agriculture, humans have wanted to really maximize for efficiency. So, it's technically easier to bulldoze acres and acres and put it all in the same crop because then you only need, say, one or two kinds of machinery to manage it.
Right.
But in essence, that's not actually what the landscape and what the existing flora and fauna need, right?
Yeah.
The diverse.
Um, we need to go to another break.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll be right back. I'm Matthew Chase Daniel talking with Melanie Kirby. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. My name is Matthew Chase Daniel. I'm talking with Melanie Kirby about bees. And we were just mentioning during the break about how sort of bees live in community. Bees, there's what people call native bees and introduced bees, like the honeybee as the poster child, but there's other non-honeybees that are also not from around here, who live here. And you were saying a bit that you sort of are struggling against that, um, cutting it in two and saying these are the native ones and they belong, and these are the non-native ones and they don't belong, because we're all here and we all need to make it work together, whether we're bees or humans. So yeah, talk a little more about how you see that.
Yeah, I really see, especially here in our country, honeybees are very much even a reflection of us as people. I mean, they're a product of the melting pot. And so when they were reintroduced, they were brought in, um, of course, particularly from the coastal areas initially, because it was a long, arduous journey, right? So when, you know, pilgrims were coming over, it was really long and hard, and they didn't know what they were going to find here. So they brought seeds, they brought sheep, they brought horses, they brought cows, they brought all sorts of things, right? Um, but then as the bees were brought over and started to adapt, they started to spread westward as well. And then we also had the invention of steamships, so then that made it a little bit easier to start bringing things over. And so even bees then from countries that were even farther away here. But over time, honeybees, which people don't realize, there's different ecotypes of them too. There's different races of them. There's over 30 recognized races of honeybees, which is still one species. So like humans, we're all human, but we have different ethnicities, right?
Hmm.
And over time, they've become their own melting pot. So just like us here in this country, I mentioned having 22 different sort of, ancestry lines in my history. The same can be said for bees. So
Because they
it's
were
interesting
imported from
because,
different places.
right,
So as
right.
different strains, different ethnicities of bee came and
Yeah,
then made the, so is now,
they
if you look at,
intermingled.
they intermingled. If you
Yes.
look at the sort of what it might be a standard American honeybee and a European honeybee in France, are they different? Are they
Yes.
noticeably different? Yeah,
I don't know if they're noticeably, at least not maybe, visually,
right,
but by behavior, yes. And then of course by genetics as well.
right.
So
Interesting. And
that's
do
actually
the,
one of the things I'm really fascinated about is what we call epigenetics. So how environment shapes genes and different things get turned on or off, different traits or different behaviors depending on where you live. And for us here in this part of the world, even if we look, more specifically at the diverse indigenous cultures we have, they have been able to persist um, due to the fact that they've really learned how to live in this environment, right? They've
Sure.
learned from the landscape and from the land itself. And so the same can be said for bees. In these other countries where they don't have as much mass movement of different kinds of bees, their bees have really retained their own what we call ecotypes. They're really rooted in that particular place.
Right.
So we have Apis mellifera ligustica, which refers to Italian bees, Apis mellifera iberiensis, which is Spanish, Apis mellifera mellifera, which happens to be what they call a little black European bee, which does exist in France and even Germany. And the list goes on. Like I said, there's over 30 recognized subspecies of
Right.
honey.
And do you do work with like breeding bees to adapt to different climate regions and different ecological conditions? And is that from those different races of bees sort of observing what they have that might be better adapted to this or that and trying to create one that's more adapted to a certain region? Or talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah, you're skirting around it for sure. I mean, and I'm glad that you're bringing this up because I wouldn't say I'm necessarily creating anything. I'm just really looking and observing and monitoring for those traits that present themselves as localized adaptation. So I call it the bees as seeds experience, right? So when we look at plants, for instance, um, we look at plants that can actually survive here and that can do well here, right? And those are the
Hmm.
ones that we actually um, try to promote and really use more than things that won't. um and a part of that is just because nature knows best, right? So over eons, adaptation has evolved so that then there's particular plant like cacti know not to have thin skin, right? Like they gotta preserve their water. So the same can be said for a lot of different organisms. And so bees are a part of that for sure. And so, I call it, really trying to look at the bees more as seeds themselves. And they've got not only their genetics, but they've got these memories of existence that have been passed down from generation to generation. And as there's different, sort of plays or nuances of evolution, they then become distinct, right? Even though they're related, they can become quite distinct, and they learn from the landscape how to survive here. So I really try and find bees that are naturally pest and pathogen resistant.
Right.
Um, because we're a country that likes to move everything all around, and we are limited in water, at least here in our region. We don't have enough localized production for the amount of interest. And so, I don't want to deny anybody the opportunity to experience it, but I often, wish that we had more research, education, and outreach to just help inform stewards, because a lot of people are very well intentioned, but they don't realize that not all bees are the same. And they'll, click and ship and bring in bees from maybe a zone that has more aggressive genetics or a zone that maybe has a lot more pest and pathogen issues. And that can really impact, what we do have here.
Right,
So
because those all go out in the world and intermingle with the other bees, and they're not.
exactly,
It's not like cattle where you have them all in a fence or in a feedlot,
exactly,
and they're just going out.
exactly.
We're not really
You
take.
can't
We're
control who they party with.
right. They just go out on their own. You hope they come home at the end of the night.
Exactly. You hope they make it home safe and
Yeah,
sound.
yeah.
But
That's
that also means they can come into contact too with pesticides or fungicides. They're foraging for, pollen is their protein, nectar's their carbohydrate, and they're bringing that back. And if it's been contaminated in any way, it may not out and out kill them in that moment, but then it gets stored and then it gets fed to the young,
mhm.
and it can really weaken their immune system. So, that's one of the one of the most amazing things that I think bees have really opened my eyes to is just how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Um, the so is there an effort to raise queens and start new colonies locally from local colonies rather than, as you say, click and ship? Because I know you can order, this was fast, I had never heard of this, but you can just order bees on the internet and they'll come in the US Postal Service, right? You get a box with bees
Yeah.
in it. Or
Yeah.
ladybugs you can get in a box. All sorts
Right.
of
I mean,
things.
so,
Yeah.
and that, I'm so glad you brought that up too, because yeah, I mean, bees aren't the only ones. I mean, even chicks, right? Like you can order all sorts of things in the mail, butterflies, um, mason bees, all different kinds of critters are shipped. And I think it really behooves us as, stewards, to just make sure we do our research and make
Yeah.
sure that we're, what we are choosing to bring in is healthy, and that it really is suited for our local conditions. um yeah, people ship them and it can be pretty stressful, so our
Hold
process, at
on,
least.
Melanie,
Oh,
I
sorry.
got to interrupt. We got to go to our last break. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. I'm talking to Melanie Kirby about bees. So, are how do bees so like you have a queen and you have all these other bees and the queen is sort of the matriarch in the middle of
Mhm.
the community. And then does if there's the hive gets to a certain size, do they produce a new queen and the group splits? And is that how does that work?
Yes.
Like, so how do you, like when you order bees online, you're getting a queen. How do the queens come to
How
be?
did all the magic happen? Yeah. Well, of course, the bees do most of the work for sure. And yeah, the queen is really the heart of the hive, but she's as much slave as she is their leader, right?
Mhm,
There's a lot of communication happening with pheromones, and she's releasing pheromones that inhibit the development of the ovaries of all her daughters, but her
mhm,
daughters are also feeding her a particular diet, a royal jelly, that doesn't allow her to be anything other than the queen that she is. So it's a really interesting relationship that she has. And then of course she's also has sons too, but the sons go off to mate,
mhm.
and they're actually, for all intents and purposes, they only carry her genetics, so they're kind of clones of her, so to speak. Not
Oh,
not
interesting.
identical by any means,
Right.
but so they're the ones who are actually the seed carriers. They're the ones who are carrying her genetic information. So as a breeder, I of course want to rear daughter. They only carry half of their mother's genetics, but it's really the sons within a hive that carry the full genetics. So, the queen is reproducing. She can lay up to about 1,500 eggs every day during the warm season or during the growing season. And about 1,500 bees, are dying every day too. That, during the growing season, they really do kind of work themselves out of a job. They'll work till their wings tear and they sort of age out. But once they really grow, so if conditions are well, if there's enough forage, they can, basically run out of space within their abode. And so then they'll decide to reproduce on a superorganismal level. So if you look at each bee as like an individual cell, right?
Hmm.
Then collectively, they create this larger body, a superorganism. And so, yeah, once they get cramped, they will rear new queens, and those queens will literally, one will come out and try and find the others, and they fight to the death, sort of thing. But a
Hmm.
few of them that make it, they'll spit out swarms. And so what happens is, it's actually quite fascinating. The colony will decide to starve their original queen, their main mother, enough so that she loses weight. She's light enough to fly, because when she's laying eggs, she's quite plump. um, and then so she will leave with the main swarm with about half the population. And then the other, what we call virgin queens, will battle it out, so to speak. Sometimes a few of them will also leave with a portion of the colony if it's really, really cramped. And hopefully one will remain the victor and stay.
Hmm.
And then she'll go out and mate with drones from other colonies. This all happens up in the air. Um, and not really close because they know enough that they don't want to, become
Interbreed.
a threat, right? Yeah.
Right.
And then yeah, she'll come back and keep that colony going. So
Right. Wow.
the half that leaves, actually, the original half with the original queen, they engorge themselves on honey because they have to basically start a whole new, you know, abode.
Oh,
They have to
right. They have
solve
to
it.
build
Oh,
the comb and right.
exactly.
Takes a lot of
Yeah,
energy. Yeah, I've seen
it
those
does.
swarms moving, and people are always calling their beekeeper friends. There's a swarm. You want it? Come and get it.
Exactly.
And they come and collect the queen, and they all climb in the
Exactly.
box. And
Swarms are actually really quite docile too. I mean, it
yeah,
depends on the genetics, but they're just trying to find a home. Sometimes they'll send scouts out and go and they'll, congregate on an area, but maybe only be there for a few hours or overnight while they really find where they want to move to.
yeah.
But they're ingenious. I mean, they make their homes in all sorts of places. I've relocated hives from caves, from underneath hot tubs and inside grills, inside a tractor once too, in canales. They really like canales. Um, yeah, any space where they feel like they can be protected from the elements um, can potentially become a little home for them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to just give you a chance. Looking through your CV and stuff, there's so many different organizations that you're a part of, and whatever you want to tell people. I know you're part of IAIA, and that's sort of a fascinating, their land grant program, which investigates agriculture. So there's a program there. And then on the Pollinator Advisory Committee of NAREE and Zia Queen Bee's Farm and Field Institute. And so talk a little bit about um, those things that you're a part of.
Yeah, bees have really helped me to not only establish but expand um, not only my network, but, in a larger network within different community groups. For the past 5.5 years, I have been serving as an extension educator and pollinator specialist at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I'm transitioning into a little bit slightly different role. I'm just focusing on finishing up some pollinator and plant research with them, but we're working on creating a bee atlas for Pueblo and indigenous communities in our region. That way it can serve as a referential guide. We're also doing that through non-lethal methods. So, as an entomologist, a lot of people sort of are trained to collect and then you pin them, right? But
Mhm.
we're doing this without actually the lethal side of it. So it involves macro photography. I've been able to include students on occasion with that, which is really awesome. And the students have also been able to help with creating a pollinator guide and yeah, just sort of taking it into all these different directions with their
That's
art.
great.
We've had exhibits, we've had recordings. So the land grant program actually has a new hub site, which is pretty awesome. And yeah, I believe you can find it at www.iaia.edu/land-grant. And land grant basically, it's a land grant university, and land grant universities are the ones that are provided funding to develop agriculture extension.
Nice.
But yeah, there's some new team members there, so we'll see what interesting programs they develop as well as I sort of transition out of my current role there. My farm, the Queen Bees Farm and Field Institute, has been around for over 20 years, and I've been able to help found two organizations. One's called the Adaptive Bee Breeders Alliance, and it includes bee breeders from across the US and also researchers from across the US. And we've gotten a couple grants and really grateful to New Mexico Community Capital for being our fiscal sponsors on those grants. And that's actually looking at exactly that, working on the bees as seeds concepts and really working with folks in different regions to help cultivate regionally adapted stock. And then one of the projects I'm really passionate about that I'm excited to really expand more is what we call the Flower Path Conservancy.
Hmm.
And we used to go by the name Popovi, which also means flower path in Tewa. And that is actually, it was founded by a small collective of indigenous matriarchs from different pueblos. We had Roxanne Swensel from Santa Clara Pueblo, and Beata Sosi Pena, who's also from Santa Clara, and Adelina Lucero, who's from Taos Pueblo, and myself. And yeah, we're looking to establish seed sanctuaries. Roxanne already has a couple really beautiful ones, but part of the inspiration for that has really been because of the wildfires that we've had, and not
Hmm.
enough local native seeds, to help regenerate those landscapes. So we're really encouraging everybody to plant more flowers, and to reduce or not use pesticides and other toxic chemicals, but really look to share with each other to help regenerate these landscapes, not only for the pollinators, but also for our own health and wellness, and for biodiversity conservation. So yeah, you can check out nectarnomad.org. You
Hmm.
can also check out the Flower Path or it's called Flower Path Conservancy
Hmm.
on Instagram. Yeah, there's all sorts of stuff. You can
Yeah,
just Google
and
it up.
just Google Melanie Kirby and bees, and you'll find all sorts of interesting things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're out of time now, but I just want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. It's fascinating, and it's great to hear your passion for this, and just sort of looking at I wrote down something before, reciprocal conservation, and that it's not just about humans over here and nature over there and this species and that species, but it's more about a model of, as we started talking about, everyone working together and making it work with where we are now. And I think that's
Yeah,
really
if I could
important.
say one last thing on that topic, because I think it's really important. As humans, we tend to at the top of the food chain, but the truth is we are the youngest species on this planet. And
Hmm.
there are so many other beautiful plant and animal relatives that have been here for much longer that really have a lot to teach us if we take the time to learn.
Yeah.
So, the rocks are the oldest and they know the most.